So let's go ahead and get into it. 5 reasons to be excited about Auburn football in 2022. First reason, for the first time since 2016, Auburn has a legitimate quarterback battle. And you could take the 2016 part of that however you want, but the Tigers actually have a serious quarterback battle on their hands for the first time in a while. This isn't Bo Nix versus Malik Willis. This isn't Sean White versus Jarrett Stidham. This is a legitimate quarterback battle. TJ Finley is the incumbent. Zach Calzada is likely the favorite. I would assume that most fans would agree that Zach Calzada is the favorite to win the job, but he's not healthy right now, not going to be able to participate to the fullest extent in spring. And then let's see, Robbie Ashford, the transfer from Oregon, he's competing in the competition as well. And then Holden Geriner, the true freshman. I would argue that Robbie Ashford's the dark horse of this group. Obviously, the one that kind of stands out. I mean, you've got Finley and Calzada as the front runners, and then you've got Holden Geriner, who is kind of out of the picture, but he's being included. He's being included in the battle. But Robbie Ashford, I think, is the most interesting guy out of this quarterback battle, and this should be exciting for fans for a couple reasons. This entire competition. First of all, I think it's worthy of noting that there's significant depth in the quarterback room. I mean, the top 2 guys have legitimate SEC experience. They've both played at SEC schools, one of them for an entire season, one of them 5 games at LSU, a few games here at Auburn. And all 4 of these different guys in the room have legitimate SEC experience, or 2 of these guys have legitimate SEC experience. And then on top of that, all of them have different traits that are likable and desirable. TJ Finley looks like Ben Roethlisberger in the pocket, very, very strong arm. I think his decision-making overall is sound. He just needs to work on his accuracy a little bit. Robbie Ashford, probably the dual threat of this group, also has a very, very strong arm and not afraid to challenge tight windows. Holden Geriner would probably work very, very well in a system that revolves around the short and intermediate passing game, which Auburn is going to have moving forward. And then Zach Calzada, a little bit of a gunslinger, a very, very gritty type of player. We got to see that on full display against the Crimson Tide last season. It's a very exciting quarterback battle, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the way it plays out. The second reason to be excited about Auburn football in 2022, Auburn's forming an identity on offense, or at least they're going to attempt to. They're making a clear attempt to. Since 2018, the Tigers have really struggled to find any sort of rhythm or identity on the offensive side of the ball, and last season certainly was no exception. Auburn came into the season saying that they wanted to control the pace of the game. They wanted to be able to establish the run, and they ended up throwing a lot because that was what Mike Bobo, the offensive coordinator, wanted to do, and that's what Auburn ended up doing. But Brian Harson wants to have an offense that features a physical rushing attack that controls the game and then eventually wears down the opponents. And I think Auburn's going to attempt to do that. I think it's very clear what Auburn's identity this season wants to be. And I believe they're going to eventually form that as the season goes on. The third reason to be excited about Auburn football in 2022, the defense is going to be very, very solid. I mentioned it on yesterday's show. ESPN put out their S&P ratings just a couple of weeks ago. Auburn's defense currently rated 14th in the country. It's going to be a very, very solid unit. Auburn's defense marginally improved last season after it suffered in Kevin Steele's last year on the Plains in 2020. The defensive line has some excellent edge rushers, and we're going to actually get to that in our conversation with Zac Blackerby later on in the show. But Derek Hall, Eku Leota, Colby Wooden, and then guys like Jason Jones and Jeffrey Imba in the interior to bolster the depth. They've got some really, really solid guys on the defensive line. I think this unit is going to get pressure a lot this season. I think it's going to be a focal point. It's going to be something that people are talking about. And then also the linebackers are going to be interesting. Owen Papo is going to be back from injury. Hopefully, fingers crossed, knock on wood. North Carolina transfer Eugene Asante is also going to be there as well. The Tigers have a very solid front seven. There's speed, there's IQ. I think there's reason to believe that this front seven, this unit is going to be nasty. And the defensive backfield, they might have lost Roger McCreary, the All-American cornerback, There's still some really interesting names to look out for. Donovan Kaufman, we'll get to see how he develops. Austin Osbury will get looks at nickel. Cornerbacks loaded. They've got Jalen Simpson, Keontae Scott, Nehemiah Pritchett, DJ James, JD Rim. A lot of different names there I'm really excited about. Specifically, I'm hype about Keontae Scott. Very, very excited about him. Number one JUCO in the corner in the nation. I'm excited about all of these guys. I think all of them will be able to contribute. And much like the quarterback position, there's a little bit of depth, and there's going to be a lot of competition. I'm interested to see how this plays out. It's another reason why you should be excited about Auburn football in 2022. The fourth reason, talked about this on yesterday's show. Auburn's schedule, in my opinion, sets up really, really well. They've got their first 5 games at home, and the competition ramps up in difficulty. So Auburn gets to ease their quarterback of choice into a season with 5 straight home environments. And every single time they add on a little bit more difficulty. It's like playing a video game and leveling up. You get to progress, and you get to have more and more challenge as the game progresses, but also you get to learn new things. So, and I think that Auburn's quarterback of choice are going to get to play Mercer. Then they're going to get to play San Jose State. And then I believe they'll be ready for the big challenge against Penn State at home. That's a 50-50 matchup there. You play Missouri, and then you play LSU, who I think is the most difficult team out of that 5-game stretch. And then after that, obviously, you've got Georgia, you've got Ole Miss on the road, Arkansas, Mississippi State, Texas A&M, Western Kentucky, Alabama. The schedule becomes increasingly difficult, obviously, as you wade into a conference play. But I'm really excited about the way this schedule sets up. I think that it's very ideal for a team that doesn't know who their quarterback's going to be. That's another reason to be excited. And then the final reason, Brian Harson has experience. We touched on this a little bit during our conversation with Zac Blackerby coming up. I'm really excited to see Harson in year 2. Now that he's gotten to see what the SEC has to offer, he'll be able to adjust in areas where things went wrong last season. He'll be able to make improvements this year. And I think he's going to be able to correct some of the mistakes that we were talking about yesterday when we were talking about expectations for Auburn football, talked about some of the weird play calling, talked about some of the weird timing on trick plays, just questionable decision-making overall. I think he is not, I doubt he makes those same mistakes again in 2022, or at least all of them. And then also something to keep in mind, he's piloting the offense now. And I'm really excited to see what that looks like. Fans are hopefully going to get to see Tank Bigsby in full effect. They're going to get to see the ground game go. They're going to get to see Jarquez Hunter whenever he comes back from injury. He's going to be fully healthy in the fall. We're going to get to see him continue to develop. And then I think the most important thing is I think Harson will understand this season to how to use the run game in full effect in situations where Auburn needs to utilize it. Auburn's going to be able to operate with a chance to fix mistakes after such a hot start last season. I'm very, very excited about Harson adjusting because I believe that he will. I think he's a good coach. So those are my 5 reasons to be excited about Auburn football in 2022. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching on Facebook, want to leave a comment as to what you're excited about with Auburn football in 2022. Would love to hear your thoughts. Before we move on to our conversation with Zac Blackerby, follow us on the socials. You can find us on Twitter at @SI_Auburn. You can also follow us on Facebook at Auburn Daily. We are also live streaming, if you're not already there, on Twitch. We're also on Facebook Live as well. We're streaming to YouTube, as I just mentioned. All right. We had a conversation with Zac Blackerby earlier, talking about the quarterback battle. We're going to go in depth, talking about these 4 different guys that are in the race. And we're also going to touch on what we discussed yesterday, expectations for Auburn football in 2022. Got a comment here from Trey Lee. He's really excited to see the defense this season, and I 100% agree. Trey Lee, writer at auburndaily.com. I'm very, very excited, like I mentioned earlier, about the front 7. And I think that people are going to be concerned about the defensive backfield because McCreary is gone, but there are so many different names that excite me. Keontae Scott, Nehemiah Pritchett, Jalen Simpson, 3 guys I'm hype about. I'm very, very hype about. All right, let's go ahead and kick it to our conversation with the one and only Zac Blackerby. We are now excited to be joined by a very special guest, Zac Blackerby of the Locked On Auburn podcast, joining us today. Zac got a lot of things going on over at Locked On Auburn, but one of the more recent conversations that you've been having on the podcast that kind of piqued my interest is you're really diving into this quarterback battle. Obviously, Demetrius Davis entering the transfer portal, so the Auburn quarterback battle is now down to 4 different players: Holden Geriner, Robbie Ashford, Zach Calzada, and TJ Finley. What have you seen out of these 4 guys so far during spring practice?
Yeah, well, we haven't seen much of Calzada at all, right? I mean, in that yellow limited jersey due to that that non-throwing shoulder. So, that's a bummer. And Harson confirming late last week that it's going to stay that way. It's not really going to change. And so that's a bummer. I think that's what a lot of people kind of expected him to come in and win the starting job. And, how much of a true competition can you have when maybe the favorite going into all of this isn't able to come in and compete? So that's an interesting element of all of this. I'll tell you what, Robbie Ashford has impressed me. I didn't really get his transfer announcement when he decided he was coming in, but it sounds like he's working his tail off. It sounds like he's impressing his teammates and his coaches. And so right now with Calzada not practicing, it seems like Ashford is getting most of the number 2 reps. But TJ Finley, I think is a hungry player coming into all of this. It seems like the biggest thing was his accuracy and just kind of processing the game of football. And he has really impressed folks from what I've seen. And, during these open practice windows, media has talked nonstop about how impressive his accuracy looks as far as the improvement from where it was when we saw him up in Birmingham in that loss to Houston. And so that's something that I think Auburn fans should be excited about, Lance. And then Holden Geriner, I think he looks really sharp for a freshman, but I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of him in 2022. And I think that was the plan all along. I don't think that's a surprise, but he certainly looks the part as a true freshman. But I think in all of this, the biggest takeaway is I think TJ Finley has taken a big step forward.
I'm really excited about the competition that Auburn currently has going on at the quarterback position. And, from what I've heard, Robbie Ashford came in, and one of the biggest things, one of the lures to Auburn football for him was the fact that he could come in and actually compete. And we've gotten to see him in spring practice working on his accuracy as well as TJ Finley. And like you said, I'm impressed with what Finley has done so far this spring, but you really have to think about the situation that he was put into. And this is something that you've harped on your podcast, Zac, is he was kind of set up to fail whenever he was kind of thrown into the fire last season. And now he's got a full spring. He's got another year in Harson's system. He's going to get to really learn what the nuances of the system are about. He's going to be able to work on his accuracy. I think something else that he has to work on is his decision-making and his timing. We saw in the Alabama game just several times where it was taking him a really long time to get through his reads. Of course, who wouldn't have a hard time against that Alabama defense, but still, I want to see him kind of pick up the pace in that aspect of the game. But overall, I'm very impressed with the way that Finley has performed throughout spring practice. Obviously, Zach Calzada, like you mentioned, currently injured. It's going to be interesting to see how the quarterback battle shifts whenever he comes back in fall camp, obviously dealing with that non-throwing shoulder injury right now. Could we potentially see this battle kind of morph into a Finley Calzada type of thing in the fall, or is it going to truly be a 3-man, 4-man race by the time the season rolls around?
No, and I think TJ is going to run away with it in the spring, just based off of, how these reps are being split up. And then in the fall, I think it's Finley versus Calzada, which is kind of what we all expected going into spring. Maybe some of the D. Davis truthers thought that, maybe he would have a chance to go on a run in spring. And now, obviously, that's not the case anymore. So, reps are just so important, Lance, especially at the quarterback position. And, you mentioned Finley being, a little inconsistent in regards to the Alabama game. But he was that way in all of his appearances last year. But like you said, he was set up to fail. And that wasn't anyone's fault. It's just kind of the nature of it. As a football team and as an offensive unit, you're supposed to get better each and every week throughout the season. That's why you practice. And, the more you do anything with other people that are involved, the better you get at it. And over the course of the season, I think the offense was getting better with Bo Nix. And then obviously Bo Nix, messed up his ankle and TJ Finley was thrust into the action. And this was just an offense that was catered to Bo Nix. I mean, they are different quarterbacks. They have different skill sets. And also, the timing from a quarterback to a wide receiver is extremely important. And then, a lot of people are thinking back to the bowl game. Like, I think Finley was hurt, probably even in the Iron Bowl. And it's just, he's already not a very mobile quarterback. And the fact that his ankle was messed up as well, I think it was Finley's ankle, he couldn't move. And so there just wasn't a whole lot to build around because there wasn't a whole lot there. Tank had a hard time, running the football consistently behind this offensive line. And there were times where Finley would get the ball to a receiver and they would drop it. I mean, there just wasn't a whole lot to really build upon. And that's not TJ Finley's fault. And so I think this will be the first time, Lance, despite him starting several games at LSU as a freshman and then starting, the tail end of the season last year, this will be the first offseason where his coaching staff and a football program is investing in him to be the starter, the planned starter going into the season. And that stuff really matters. It really, really matters because it's, spring is when you build your football team. Fall is when you get ready for the season. And right now they're building this football team around TJ Finley. And I think that's telling.
I'm excited to see what happens with the quarterback battle. I'm excited to see if Finley develops. And that's actually something that we talked about on yesterday's show. We went through expectations for Brian Harson and Auburn football in 2022. I want to kind of run down the 4 different categories of expectations that I have and just get your thoughts on what the expectation should be for the Tigers this season. Let's start with development. Expectation for development. Obviously, Gus Malzahn was not the best at developing, I think, skill position players, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Obviously, everybody knows his track record with the quarterback position. Obviously, there's been numerous times where Malzahn has flipped players from offense to defense, and they've been former 4-stars, and they've never really panned out. What have you seen from Brian Harson so far, and what should be the expectation for Auburn in terms of developing the players they currently have on roster?
I think it's too soon to tell, but, I think the talented players on this team have gotten opportunities. I mean, Tank Bixby was a 1,000-yard rusher, probably should have been more, but I think the offensive line held him back. There were some moments in key games where you're like, okay, I wish Tank would have gotten more touches there. As far as the wide receivers, Kobe Hudson, I think, was a pretty vocal point. I think they kind of got better at using him throughout the year. And so now that may be Javaris Johnson moving forward. We'll have to wait and see. Jay Fair seems to be a guy that could possibly, bust onto the scene in 2022. And then, a guy like John Samuel Shanker, who has the ability, who had the experience, but didn't really have the usage. We saw him have a historic year by Auburn standards last year. And so I think it's too soon to tell, okay, so-and-so on the offensive side has gotten significantly better since Brian Harson stepped foot, or at least better compared to, just the natural, you're going to get better every year. Like, the more you do anything, the better you're going to be at it. So I think it's too soon to tell, Lance. I mean, there's no one on this team where I'm like, okay, they should be farther along than they are currently. And so I guess that's a good sign. But, the wide receiver room this year, as far as what their production is going to be, doesn't matter who the quarterback is. Whatever the wide receiver production is, if it exceeds expectations, which I think a lot of Auburn people's expectations are pretty low in regards to production at the wide receiver room, if they come out and be a really strong unit throughout 2022, I think that answers that question. And a lot of people are going to be really pleased with what Brian Harson and his staff has done.
Expectations for recruiting. Brian Harson, a little bit behind the 8 ball in his first season, trying to recruit on the Plains. Just had to kind of salvage the class that Gus Malzahn had left. Both recruiting classes under Harson have been 19th nationally, 7th and 9th in the SEC. There's some work to do on the recruiting front. We're already getting to see some promising things develop. Not a lot of big commits just yet. What should be the expectation for this next year's class?
Yeah, and that second ranking is actually worse. I mean, Auburn is not a top 20 class if you don't count Trey Donaldson. And Trey Donaldson is a basketball player, but he counted in Auburn's football signing class. So take that for what it's worth. I think you got to get better. If you're not going to win in the recruiting front, you've got to win in the transfer portal. And Auburn's not really doing either of those things right now. So you've got to figure that out. Auburn did not help Brian Harson with the crap that happened for, that 2-week span earlier in the offseason. I think we all can agree on that. That was not good for Auburn, especially the way it was handled. It even made it somehow worse. So the expectations for that are pretty low just because it's been pretty bad. And it's not all Harson's fault. I think some of it is, but it's not all Harson's fault. And so I'm not a guy that thinks you have to be a top 10 recruiting class every year at Auburn with what the transfer portal can bring you. But the fact that Auburn hasn't really added a whole lot so far this offseason going into spring is kind of a bummer. I mean, I think DJ James, the Oregon corner, Jason Jones, the Oregon defensive tackle, Eugene Asante, the North Carolina linebacker, I think those were big wins. And I think all of those guys will be key contributors at different levels of the defense. I think that's exciting. But with these key positions of need for the last 2 off seasons, Auburn has gone after, offensive linemen and wide receivers. And these guys get on campus, and then a few days later, they put out their top 5. And with some of these, Auburn's not even on it. Auburn's not even cutting it. And so it's like, you got to figure that out, Lance. You've got to figure that out if you're Brian Harson and the staff. So as far as expectations recruiting, they're probably pretty low.
Yeah, and that's something that we talked about on yesterday's show is that there are 4 SEC teams that only have 1 commit right now, and Auburn's one of them. And it was very similar to last season. Auburn started off very, very slow on the recruiting trail, and you've got to be able to pick it up. I'm not asking right now this early in the cycle for you to have 10 commitments like Arkansas does for the 2023 class. I'm not asking for that, right? But what I'm asking for is for you to be in contention, like you said, with some of these positions of need, wide receiver and offensive line specifically too, that Auburn really, really needs to pick up the pace on. I believe Stanton Ramel is an offensive lineman out of the state of Alabama that Auburn is currently looking at. They potentially might get, but outside of that, I mean, if you look at the in-state recruiting for Auburn right now, they're not really in the running for a lot of different guys. It's mostly Florida, Georgia, or Alabama leans or commits. And so Auburn's got to be able to pick it up recruiting wise. It's not a huge concern for me just yet, but it's definitely one of my bigger areas of concern. Moving along here, expectation for schematics. There were some questionable decisions made by Brian Harson and Derek Mason. I think some people were frustrated with the way some games played out last season. Obviously, we talked about this on yesterday's show. The fade on 4th down against Penn State, the continuous use of zone defense, just some weird timing on trick plays. I mean, it was just kind of consistent where it's just like, okay, what are we doing here in terms of calling plays and schematics and different things like that? I think I'll go ahead and say, I think the expectation for 2022 is that those things kind of go away now that Harson has gotten a year in the SEC and kind of gotten to figure out what things are about. What are the expectations for you in terms of schematics?
I think they're going to be okay. And I think Brian Harson being the main guy with the offense with Keesau, I think that's going to be a good move. I really do. I think you're going to see more Tank Bigsby. I think you're going to see more intermediate passing, and I think you're going to see more play action, assuming the offensive line can hold up there. And so that, I think, will make everything better. I think Auburn threw it a ton last year. And I know they were building this offense around Bo Nix and, Mike Bobo liked to pass the ball. I think that's going to change. All this talk that we heard Harson say when he came in about the 4th and 1 mentality and, this blue collar style of football, I think you're going to see more of that with him kind of being the offensive guy. And defensively, I didn't hate the zone as much as everyone else did. I do think Auburn needs to do more as far as rushing the passer, and they should be better at that this year with Derek Hall and Eku Leota kind of being the guys on the edges. So I'm not as concerned about that. I think you get worse in the defensive backfield, but I'm only saying that because we don't know. I mean, you lose Roger McCreary, he's probably going to be a 2nd-round pick, and then Smoke Monday, who was a long starter. But let's not pretend, while Smoke was valuable, let's don't act like he was great in pass coverage. And so I think you have the chance to build something there, and they've got a lot of depth in the defensive secondary. So I think with what Auburn is going to have to defend week in and week out, with the SEC getting these, future NFL stars at wide receiver, you may want to play more zone. And I know that's not something that Auburn fans are excited about, but like Roger McCreary is a bump and run man corner. DJ James is not. He played a lot of zone at Oregon. And so, I think they're going to be okay with deciding, whatever they want to do. And if they want to do different things, I think that's a good move. So my expectations for the scheme side of things are actually pretty high, Lance, and they may be higher than they actually should be.
And I think you made a phenomenal point about the zone defense. And that's something that I said on yesterday's show was I think the pass rush, not that last year's pass rush was bad, but I think it's going to be better this season. And it's going to limit time for opposing quarterbacks to make decisions and throw into soft spots into the zone coverage. I don't think fundamentally zone's a bad defense. There's a reason it exists and there's a reason so many different people use it. But I think that an element of the zone coverage that will make it even better is not allowing the quarterback to pick it apart and find those soft spots. So I think the defensive line is definitely going to wreak havoc this season. I'm excited about that. Finally,
you look at Atlanta, and sorry to cut you off, but I mean, as far as there's the defensive presence and the push up front. When we talk about Eku and Hall on the edges, but Marcus Harris is a guy that has gained some weight, and if he can keep that first step going, that's going to be exciting as far as rushing the passer and pushing the pocket back into the quarterback. And then obviously Colby Wooden. I mean, those are 4 NFL type guys that are going to be up there. And then Jason Jones is so good at winning at the point of attack as well that we saw him do at Oregon. There's a lot to like about this. And I think they're going to be able to get to the quarterback without having to blitz a whole lot, because you did not see them blitz a ton last year. We'll see what the difference is between Derek Mason and Jeff Schmedding as far as calling, sending extra guys to go and get the quarterback. But yeah, I'm with you. I think Auburn's going to be much better defensively than they were a season ago.
And then finally here, expectations for winning. We're not going to go through the entire schedule. I talked about it on yesterday's show, but it sets up nicely. First 5 games at home. You don't necessarily have to put a specific record out there. Just what should be the expectation for Auburn in 2022 in terms of winning?
I think anything better than 6-6, if you're an Auburn fan, you got to feel decent about it. And obviously it depends on how you look in the losses and who, those 7 wins could possibly be. But if Auburn could go 5-0 in those 5 home games, I mean, the big one's Penn State. Can you beat Penn State at home? I think they can. I think in Jordan-Hare Stadium, Auburn can beat anyone. And so the way the schedule lines up, I think helps the Tigers, because your toughest 2 games are on the road, and you're probably not going to win those anyway. Like, you're probably not going to beat Alabama this year. And so you might as well put it on the road. And you're probably not going to beat Georgia. So you might as well just play it in Athens. And so these games that I think are a coin flip, your LSU, your Texas A&M, your Penn State, like, I think it's good that those are at home. And the other coin flips, the Mississippi schools, like, it stinks that you got to play in Oxford, and it stinks that you got to play in Starkganistan. But I think the Starkville game is winnable, and I think those 3 home games are winnable. And so if you can figure out how to do that, you look up at the end of the season, it's like, oh wow, we survived, and somehow we're 8-4. Like that would be something I think most Auburn fans would be happy with. But Lance, if they can find a way to go 7-5, I think that's enough to kind of get some hope circulating throughout the program.
I think you have to just see some type of improvement, like you said, on a 6-6 record. Zac, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tell everybody where they can find your phenomenal content.
Yeah, it's all at auburndaily.com. This is the Auburn Daily Show. And so be sure to check out everything that I'm writing, that Lance is writing. We've got the best Auburn baseball writer out there with Lindsay Crosby, who I think you're talking to today as well, Lance. So, we're really excited to partner with Sports Illustrated to get all of this content up at auburndaily.com every single day, including this show that you're off to a hot start with, Lance.
Thank you so much again for Zac for coming on. We hope to have you on again soon.
Hey, thanks, guys.
All right, there was Zac Blackerby, host of the Locked On Auburn podcast, writer for Auburn Daily, joining us on the show. And he's right. We will have Lindsay Crosby, host of the Locked On MLB Prospects podcast, on here, but in just a second. But before we do that, want to just kind of reiterate some of the things that Zac was saying about the defense. And I mentioned this before we started that pre-recorded segment there. I don't necessarily think the problem lies in the fact that Auburn runs zone. I know a lot of people were really frustrated with what Derek Mason was doing last season with the Tigers, and I think a lot of people point to that Penn State game as just a big question mark on the schedule, and then the Mississippi State game as well is just not adjusting and not changing up the defense. I think I'm more concerned about just the soundness, the technique of the defense instead of the fact that they're running zone coverage. And like I said there, it's not necessarily zone coverage. I mean, there's a reason why different programs run it. You've got to be able to generate a pass rush first and foremost. And then on top of that, you've got to have the correct personnel to run it efficiently. And, I don't think that it was fair to assume that with Auburn transferring from a unit that primarily ran man-to-man systems under Kevin Steele to immediately to a zone look with a 3-man front under Derek Mason. I think it was it was a tough ask to ask all those man-to-man guys to adjust and to change what they were about and then work their way into the zone defense. So that's my thought there on the defense. And I'm really excited about just this season in general. I'm really excited about the defense, and we'll continue to talk about it throughout the offseason. I'm sure we'll be able to get into some more depth chart stuff as the offseason progresses. Let's go ahead and kick it to our conversation with Lindsay Crosby previewing Auburn baseball's game tonight against Jacksonville State. The first pitch is at 6 o'clock. Here is Lindsay Crosby. We are now excited to be joined by Lindsay Crosby, writer for AuburnDaily.com and host of the Locked On MLB Prospects podcast, talking Auburn baseball's game tonight against the Jacksonville State Gamecocks, a midweek game at Plainsman Park. Lindsay, you noted in your recap of Auburn's series win over Texas A&M over at AuburnDaily.com that this game is a stop on the Atlanta Braves World Champions Trophy Tour, and the 2021 World Series trophy will be available for photo opportunities and celebrations. And I got to ask, is Blooper, the Atlanta Braves mascot, going to be there? Because if so, I need to pull up.
So I have not gotten confirmation that Blooper is coming. Now, Blooper has traveled a lot recently, so I am hoping he's there. I am a fan of Blooper. Either way, come out to the Josh Donaldson hitting lab, get your photo with the trophy, and then stick around for what should be a great matchup against the Gamecocks.
Well, let's go ahead and get into it. Auburn baseball, 17-7 on the season so far, 3-3 in the SEC, taking on Jack State, 11-11, 6-0 in the ASUN. Let's just go ahead and start here. It's a midweek game for the Tigers. They're 5-0 in midweek games this season. What do we know about the Gamecocks?
So this Gamecocks team is one that they've won 7 of their last 8. So the record is not great on its face, but if you look at recent production, they're definitely feeling good. They just swept North Alabama last weekend, and offensively, they're hitting about 250 as a team. So it's not something where you can just look past this midweek and be thinking about LSU on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You have to actually pay attention. TJ Reeves, the junior outfielder, he's batting .372. He's their biggest threat. Leads in hits, leads in runs, leads in RBIs, leads in stolen bases. But a team you have to respect offensively when you are, an Auburn team looking to get right before you go to LSU.
Obviously, that LSU series looming large here starting Thursday. Auburn taking on the number 13 Tigers. The probable starter for this matchup, Auburn Jack State, senior Jordan Armstrong. He's going to be taking on Jake Peppers, the sophomore for the Gamecocks. How do we feel about Jordan Armstrong in this matchup, Lindsay?
So Jordan Armstrong started the year off really hot, and then he stumbled a bit, and it all came down to his mechanics. He has a really unique arm slot, and from that arm slot, his changeup, which is the best changeup on the entire pitching staff, plays really well and disguises off his fastball. He struggled a bit with that slot. They had to take him out of the rotation, fix some stuff. He appeared over the weekend. He looked fantastic. I really think that we're back to the Jordan Armstrong that we saw to start the season, and we're going to give him a good, easy way to get back into starting, facing a Jacksonville State team that should give up some early runs to Auburn and should give him a nice lead to work with so he doesn't feel like he has zero margin for error.
For anyone that does not know, Auburn currently has the nation's on-base percentage leader, and you, Lindsay, have a phenomenal nickname for him. Tell us about Sonny DiChiara and what he's done for the Auburn Tigers this season.
Boy, let me tell you about our thick king, Sonny DiChiara. Yeah, 609 on-base percentage, leads the entire country. He's batting .452, which is 7th in the country, 4th in slugging at .935. So his OPS, 1544, absolutely absurd. He has played 20 games on the season, has 7 home runs on the year. And the biggest thing to me, he's played 20 games. He's been walked 22 times.
Wow.
And, probably a third of those are intentional. And so despite having a lineup that can put up a ton of runs, I mean, Auburn averages somewhere around 8.5 runs a game or so. You still have a guy in the heart of the lineup that you are intentionally walking because every time he comes up to bat, he just crushes the ball and collects RBIs. And what's great is the front part of that lineup. Leadoff hitter Blake Rambush has a 14-game hitting streak right now, is batting .450 during this, a bunch of multi-hit games. I believe it's 13. And so every time Sonny DiChiara is coming up to bat, you have an opportunity to collect RBIs. I mean, he's collected 21 RBIs on the year, again, in 20 games. And so a guy that you absolutely have to be cognizant of at all times and be ready to defend because he can hit anything you throw at him. Combine that with the energy that he brings, not only to the team, but to the fans. His walk-up song of the Italian wedding song has quickly become a classic. And I think you can say that Thick King Sonny DiChiara is the people's champ of Auburn right now.
Yeah, our thick king is raking right now for the Tigers. And quite honestly, Lindsay, I mean, you look up and down the schedule so far, Auburn's had some games where they've put a lot of runs on the board. Last season, the struggle for the Tigers was picking up wins in close games. Auburn currently 3-3 in one-run games this season, I believe. But all these runs Auburn's putting on the board, is that because of the strength of schedule that Auburn's playing? Maybe it's a little bit weaker, or are these batters really starting to figure things out?
I honestly think it's the batters figuring things out. So you look at some of the guys that they've brought in. They've brought in 3 big transfers to start this year: Blake Rambush, Sonny DiChiara, and Brooks Carlson. And all 3 of these guys have offensively delivered whenever they've been in the lineup. And then you've seen a lot of key growth from players who didn't have as big of a role last year. Catcher Ryan Dial, freshman Mike Bello in the outfield. You're seeing this offense just take on an extra dimension. And it's something that I was worried about when you look at the amount of talent that they lost graduating or being drafted off of last year's team, and a short king Ryan Bliss and a Tyler Miller and a Rankin Woley. But some of these additions have really stepped up and lengthened this lineup and given Auburn's offense a chance to stay in every single game.
One more question here for you, Lindsay, and we'll let you get out of here. Consistent pitching was an issue for the Tigers last season. What have we seen out of the bullpen this year, and what can we expect out of the Tigers rotation coming tonight? Obviously, like you mentioned, a huge series against LSU coming up. Will the Tigers limit themselves in this game?
So I expect to see, after Jordan Armstrong's done, I expect to see either one guy, you try to throw him the bulk of the innings, or you take a lot of pitchers and you throw them one inning at a time. And the idea there is get everybody in a little bit of work. You don't have to do a bullpen if you go out and throw tonight, but you obviously want to keep guys safe. One of the guys I expect to see pitch tonight out of the bullpen is Joseph Gonzalez. He's been a starter for Auburn for quite a while. He started as a freshman last year, and he's missed the last 2 weekend series with an under fingernail blister on his middle finger of his throwing hand. He reported that it was pressing his fingernail up off the bed. A lot of pain there. He could play catch, but he couldn't grip a baseball well enough to throw. And reportedly, he is feeling well enough to attempt to pitch tonight. So they're going to have him come out of the bullpen a little bit later, probably to relieve Jordan Armstrong. And if he pitches well, I expect to see him back in the starting rotation this Saturday. And so you would have a Hayden Mullins, Trace Bright, Joseph Gonzalez rotation this weekend for LSU.
Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tell everybody where they can find your great content.
So I am on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. You can follow all of my writing at Auburn Daily. And if you want to listen to a podcast about minor league baseball, I've got you taken care of at Locked On MLB Prospects, available wherever you get your podcast. Absolutely fantastic work Lindsay does over at auburndaily.com, covering the Auburn baseball team. And then his podcast, Locked On MLB Prospects, is absolutely phenomenal as well. Lindsay, thanks again. Absolutely.
All right, that was our conversation with Lindsay Crosby, writer for Auburn Daily and host of the Locked On MLB Prospects podcast. And that's going to do it for today's episode of Auburn Daily. You can follow us on the socials, SI_Auburn over on Twitter, and then at Auburn Daily on Facebook, wherever you're watching, whether it be Twitch, whether it be YouTube, whether it be Facebook. Make sure you subscribe or follow so that you catch us every single weekday. We stream live at 4 o'clock Central Time. Tomorrow, I think we're going to talk a little Auburn basketball. Very, very passionate about the Tigers. Going to talk about their year and give some grades out to some of the individual players. But that's going to do it for today's episode. I will see you all then. Have a good day, everybody, and God bless.